Hall of Fame season, people. We have newly inducted members, three of them joining the rest of the enshrined, base esteemed members of Cooperstown. And today we're talking with one of the people that helped put them there, writer Dan Brown of The Athletic, discussing the Hall of Fame vote. And here we are once again. We are honored and privileged to be speaking with Dan Brown of The Athletic. Welcome, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us again to talk about the Hall of Fame, to talk about the ballot and the process, and just to be here with us and share us your insight. So, welcome. And I mean, just what have you been up to? It's been a year since we've last talked to you, besides the Hall of Fame vote, which I'm sure we will discuss in great detail.
Just studying and going over my ballot for the last 364 days. Make sure we get it.
You've gone full Aaron Rodgers, cave a darkness retreat until you can decide the ballot.
Right.
Then you go back for the next year.
2025, yes.
Well, we believe, and I guess you probably know that we loved your ballot, and we'll talk about specifically what's in there. And I think the fact that I like that you went public with the ballot this year. I don't know if you did that last year early or not. I can't remember.
Well, I did, and I would do it even earlier. The Athletic, we like to, as an outlet, we put all of our ballots public at once. So we have a big ballot reveal on one day, and writers kind of write all the story explaining their hardest decisions. But I love the tracker. I love Ryan Thibodeau and the tracker. And had admired it for so long, and it's difficult to make your ballot public because inevitably, no matter who you check, you're going to get heat. But as somebody who had followed that forever, I know how important it is to those who have a candidate they're rooting for or just are interested in the process. And I let it all hang out there.
Did you let's talk about that just for a quick second, because do you think that all the writers should make their votes public at some point? Will it be mandated from the BBWAA to make them public? They're public after, right? So on February 6th, they'll release all of the votes, but along the way, or is it not important?
Yeah, there's some split on that. I mean, for one thing, there are some writers who like the suspense. They don't like the fact that we give away, to Ryan Thibodeau and the Hall of Fame tracker. It gets anticlimactic when the ballots are revealed and people have a good idea of who's in, who's out. I don't mind it. I think there's still plenty of drama on election day because so many of the elections come down to the wire. But there's some people who like even something as small as like, hey, can so and so be unanimous this year? You might know that as early as December 2nd now. So the writer, these baseball writers association meetings, there's a big push for transparency because we always ask for that from others. Hey, be open in your process. Explain this, explain that. So we kind of try to put our, practice what we preach in being revealing and honest and open and fielding questions. And really, it's not just like put your ballot online. It's like, hey, write about why you made the decision you made so that people understand the reason, for better or for worse, because I've seen that go sideways, especially this year.
And I mean, it has to be tough. This is a stuffed ballot that we had this year where there's a lot. I mean, there was a lot of guys that is first ballot guys, but even just really good quality players. And there's a couple that we're going to discuss later. But what's it like for you? I mean, I know you were joking about, working the last 364 days on your ballot, but what is it like? Can you kind of take us through a little bit of your process in terms of like, are you looking back at last year's ballot or do you kind of start fresh every year?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, it wasn't until I was, 51 where I voted for the first time. It's my third year doing it. So I considered, having waited so long, it is, and even if I did it at, age 12, it's a sacred privilege, right? You are anointing people for immortality, and you can't do that, with your gut reaction. I know the writers in the past would just say like, hey, I know who's a Hall of Famer or not. And if I have to ask myself that question, they're not. So I think in this age of, modern metrics, they're not the be all end all, but I think they reveal a lot about what we didn't see about a player's value. And I think you are not a sophisticated voter and cannot make a reasonable kind of airtight case in court for your candidate, or for not for your candidate, but for how you voted. You got to be ready to defend that. And in this day and age, my gut reaction is not good enough to explain to an electorate who's very sophisticated now. So in general, yeah, I don't go back and look at the candidates I've studied previously. This year was a little, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but I had Abreu. I checked the box for him the year before. This year, he was essentially my 11th guy. But Mauer was an. It's interesting because you're talking about it's a loaded ballot, but it's not Babe Ruth, right? These are worthy candidates, but not necessarily slam dunk. So there really takes a lot of analysis to figure out where the line is and who's just above it and who might just be below it.
And that's gotta be it's gotta be tough because being a first ballot guy is such a part, it's such a recognition, and it's something, it's a distinction on top of just being in the Hall of Fame. Everybody kind of acknowledged how important the Mariano Rivera unanimous first ballot vote was, and sort of a remark on his career to separate him. So I'm sure that's a bit of your consideration too, where you're looking at these first year guys and being like, a guy like Mauer, that's a really big nod to what people think about him now that he is a first ballot guy.
Yeah, I tried. That's one. I consider a lot of things. I don't really. The first ballot distinction, essentially, is out of my hands. I'm just one voter, right? So is the person a Hall of Famer or not? And I don't necessarily believe that there's a, different classification for first ballot versus not. I know there used to be, and and to me, it doesn't matter that much. First ballot, second ballot, if you're a Hall of Famer or not. So
I think it
I don't
only
even
matters a
overthink
lot.
it. It's
I think it only matters in fan arguments.
yeah, right. I'm not gonna. Yeah, yeah. That's one thing I don't really consider. If others do, good for them. But I don't.
How about
I
the
don't. I don't think I'll wait a year and he deserves it. He's more of a third year guy. I don't factor that in.
That takes me to the 5% question, right? So yeah, and as Met fans here, we watch with great interest David Wright's, sort of hanging at the bottom. And I
Yeah.
think as Met fans, as much as we love him right now, I wouldn't say we're certain he's a Hall of Famer. Maybe leave it at that. And you could talk about the evolution of your voting on a particular player, how that changes, because I think that maybe has some relevancy. But maybe would they change the 5% and say, you know what, you come on the ballot, you get 3 years or some sort of other stipulation that allows to take the pressure off? Well, I better vote for this guy so he's around for next year.
Yeah, it's a good question. David Wright was 6.2% this year, and it was 6.2%, and then I saw Scott Rowland in his first year got 10.2%. So for third baseman, there is precedent that they can climb out of that kind of low initial step into to the ballot, and people start to appreciate the career in a different way. And this was a tough ballot to kind of get 5% because there were so many more pressing names up top. I have not considered that factor with the 5% guys. I have considered more who needs momentum, who might start becoming like a Larry Walker or a Tim Raines or I thought it might be Billy Wagner this year, somebody who didn't get a lot of early support but is trending the right way. I try to keep it trending the right way. I look at that. I look at people who might need a nudge. Andrew Jones is one of those. Sheffield. I mean, I think they're deserving anyway, but I definitely, when I got down to my final spots, thought about who might need a bump. And Abreu was one of those. The reason I regretted not regretted, but the reason it was difficult for me to knock him off was because of that reason. I thought he was building a little bit of momentum, and he's somebody whose career has really benefited from a longer look because it's so subtle, some of his impact. So the 5% thing I might look at more in the future this year because of the 10 names that were more considerate.
Yeah, I think the Abreu thing is that's perfect. In terms of he's a guy from my perspective that when you look at his career stats, you're thinking, man, that sure looks like what a Hall of Famer would do for his career in terms of the consistency and his ability to post. This is a guy who played in 151 games for 11 straight years. Man, that in and of itself is and he played excellently through that period. At the same time, his defensive prowess, his negative 10.9 career DWAR shocked me for a guy who won a
Yeah.
Gold Glove. I really couldn't even believe it. And so you say you've evolved with that, saying, you know what, I think he can stay on another year without me voting for him, so I can tend to something else,
Yeah.
or look at somebody else. And
Yeah.
I think that's very interesting. And I think you're not the only person who does that.
Yeah, it's and this year I really felt one of the things I considered, because I considered, you know, Mauer was, if I remember, it's because it's been a while since I voted, but he might have been my 10th guy. Uh, and it might have been like, hey, am I gonna? He's gonna be right on the line. If somebody's right on the line, and I think the Hall of Famer, I'm gonna vote for that person. Just in case I don't want to cost them because I got to take care of Abreu. But that was kind of where the thinking came, is like, yeah, there's going to be some guys who are right at that 74, like Wagner, 73.8%. Mauer didn't breeze in, he was 76.1%. So you got to say, in fact, I peeked over the tracker at some point and thought, well, okay, where these guys stand is my vote, could it be decisive one way or the other? Wasn't wasn't peer pressure or anything like that. I just thought, let's make sure if we got a chance to elect somebody worthy this year, let's do it. I really don't enjoy the years where people don't get in. I know it's been rare, but I think the era, because of the steroids, uh, it's been kind of underrepresented. And I do think some of these players merit a lot of celebration and honor. And yeah, I keep an eye on that, kind of the dividing line.
I think it's tough because this ballot, like we've talked about, was just so crowded. And the steroid era, if you look at guys like if A-Rod and Manny, just those two alone, let alone a guy like Sheffield, were already in the hall, if we didn't have that steroid question, that would have changed up this ballot so considerably, because you would have a lot of people would have had a couple extra votes to throw around, because there wouldn't be these guys where you go, they have everything a Hall of Famer should have, and it's the biggest butt in baseball.
Yeah, it's so difficult with those guys, and like one of the things, Twitter's kind of can be an awful place anyway. But the people say, like, it's so stupid. It's like, how can you, like, you're an idiot if you, like, no. There's very nuanced arguments on both sides. If you are weighing the PED users, it's not obvious to me what the right or wrong thing is to do. There are people who cheated the game. They broke the rules. They brought some disgrace to the game. They've altered the record books in kind of irretrievable ways. There are moral and ethical things that the Hall of Fame includes on the ballot about, the so-called character clause. For me, it got to be a matter of consistency. By the time I voted, David Ortiz was in. But C League was in, who profited from that steroid era. There are people who are suspected of steroids, but never, officially named, but kind of widely suspected, who are in. And to me, that was who? It was an unregulated era. It was the Wild West. It's tough to retroactively go in there as a voter when none of the people were banned. None of the people were. A lot of people weren't even punished at all. To say so now, to be the gatekeeper on that. So it's a little bit relinquishing my duty, throwing up my hands and saying, like, who am I to stop these people for their for PED use and kind of breaking the rules, fudging the rules, but also it's impossible for me to tell who was in, who was, you know what I mean? It's we don't have all the information. So if C League benefits from that era, the players who lifted him up should benefit as well.
That I very much feel the same way, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned the character, because one of the guys we were looking at that didn't get in this year that we do think will probably be an eventual Hall of Famer is Carlos Beltran. Do you
Yeah.
think he's maybe getting dinged a little bit under that, given his connection to the Astro scandal?
I think so. I think so. I mean, the Hall vote has not been kind to cheaters. I mean, the PED guys are not getting in, and the Astros scandal was serious and determined the World Series, and it really, the baseball did issue punishment in those cases. Beltran was fired, so there's a little bit of air of scandal and a little air of disgrace with him. I don't know if voters will, this is like a first ballot thing, if people are going to change their minds, or as new and younger voters come into the electorate, is that going to change the way he's perceived? But I'm surprised he doesn't get a little bit more support, to be honest.
He's being penalized. I wanted to mention something about the steroid just for a second. I saw a clip of Bob Gibson after his career talking about. Did you see this clip when he basically? I loved it because he basically said, "Well, I don't know that I wouldn't have done it." Basically, summing up what he said at that, I didn't do it. I didn't do any of that stuff. But he basically said, "I don't know." I know how I would do it. This is one of the great pictures of all time. Basically, being ambivalent about it, and so you can say yes, he didn't do it because it wasn't the case. But I think that's really interesting, and people that are uncomfortable with this would find that very discomforting if they knew that, if they had seen that clip.
Yeah, it was interesting. I do because I have listened over the years to him because that matters to me. What do the Hall of Famers who are in say? Where do they stand on this? And Joe Morgan had his letter years ago, and I purported, it might be the wrong word, but he said, like, I'm speaking for others, and I believe that to be the case. But I do wish kind of more Hall of Famers would weigh in, right or wrong, on how they feel about Bonds, McGuire, so Clemens. If we did get some kind of consensus opinion, it would be a factor in how I voted. Getting an occasional like Gibson from an old clip, or a Joe Morgan, we know two. We don't know kind of.
And neither of those guys were contemporary with those guys. It'd be very interesting to talk about some of the guys, like a guy like that will end up in the Hall of Fame that competed against these guys.
So, yeah. And then what was interesting to me is Barry did not fare well in his first year on the Veterans Committee ballot, which has ex-players on it, which does have a different. People like to say, "Oh, the writers don't vote for him because they didn't like Barry. They don't like Bonds. They didn't give him. He wasn't friendly with the press." But with a totally different voting body, he did maybe even worse based on the vote count that I remember. He didn't come close, and I think was that when McGriff got in. I mean, it was clear that the way they viewed Barry was the way a lot of voters did.
Because a lot of people didn't like Barry.
So your ballot, and let's just say so: Beltran, Beltre, Todd Helton, Andrew Jones, Joe Mauer, Manny Ramirez, Alex Rodriguez, Gary Sheffield, Chase Utley, and Billy Wagner. Did you have to decide between Chase Utley and Bobby Abreu in terms of the Philly aspect of this?
I did, and if you look at the three Phillies candidates, if you look at the WAR, I think it was Abreu who had the highest.
He does.
Not Utley. But positionally, what if you look at Jaws, which is a big determining factor for me, I think he was 11th all time among second basemen. And, his peak, his WAR 7 for his peak years were pretty incredible. He had 5 WAR years of 7 WAR years of 5 seasons with at least a 7 WAR. Same as Joe Morgan. I mean, he's an elite. It's an elite kind of air he's in. And I didn't sit down expecting to vote for him. I kind of sat down expecting I'd do Abreu just as I did the previous year. But it got harder and harder to justify when I looked at how Abreu stacked up against other second basemen versus how Abreu stacked up against other outfielders. And Abreu still fares well. I mean, he's up there, about the same kind of lifetime. Can't remember WAR or Jaws, but very similar. I think it was Jaws with Dave Winfield and Vladimir Guerrero. He's statistically he's similar to those guys, but Utley among second basemen was 11th in much rarer air. It's tough for me to. The one thing that kind of still gives me pause about that is I didn't see him play defense enough to answer some of the criticism that some Philly fans say, like he wasn't even that great defensively. Like the metrics overrate him. I don't know what you guys think or what you guys saw, but I can't.
We're Met fans. We can't really talk about that. So
we are potentially the most biased people on earth when it comes to Chase Utley.
Well, never mind. That does. I would like to maybe talk to some contemporaries and just say, hey, what as a player, how did you think of Utley's defense? This is what the metrics show. How did your eyes see it? Because I don't. If somebody said, hey, describe him and his play defensively, I wouldn't give a good answer. I know how he's great at turning two. I know
Right.
that base runners headed sliding into him, and
But at the same time, I think
improve it.
and I will say this about Utley and Abreu. So having watched them both play, being NL East, obviously watchers in general, I would just say that Abreu never struck me as being one of the top 10 players in the National League. Maybe the top 5 is a better thing. Utley, I hate to say it, there was years where I felt like he was.
Yeah.
Right, like there's years where like I don't know if Bobby Abreu was ever the best right fielder in the National League. Some years I think he maybe was debatably was, but there's at least 4 or 5 years where I can point out maybe more where Chase Utley was definitively the best second baseman in the National League.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of speaks to what you were saying with just the positional excellence puts him in a much rarer air because there have been very few second basemen that hit like him. And like when you're stacking yourself up against Joe Morgan, that's pretty rare air you're up there in.
Right. And I also think that positionally is an underrepresented spot. And the Hall of Fame snubs that make me most upset are Lou Whitaker. So, maybe Utley getting in there gives them another comp that helps them in some backwards way. But I can't stand that Lou Whitaker's not in the Hall of Fame.
We were basically saying the only reason Chase Utley shouldn't be in the Hall is because Lou Whitaker isn't in yet. We're like, Chase Utley should go in after Lou Whitaker.
Yeah,
How do you put in Chase Utley and not put in Lou Whitaker?
Yeah. No, I get that.
And Dustin Pedroia is going, hey, wait a second. I'm no, we should not. Don't be hasty about this. So he comes on next year. I wanted to ask you, and I think those guys, some of the guys on the ballot, like Beltran or whatnot, who had excellent postseason careers. And I don't know that we talked about this last year, but it strikes me that you're not supposed to factor in the player's postseason career. Is that correct? Before I go too far, that you're not supposed to really factor that. And tell me how you do it.
I do factor in the postseason. I don't give it a huge. I mean, it's part of their career. It's part of their legacy. It's part of their aura. I mean, yeah, I think that Wagner wasn't great in the postseason, but the postseason resume is so small. I think it was 11 innings. It's not gonna 11 innings in the postseason is not going to change my mind about an overall body of work. But in the chase of Utley, I know not to bring back a little controversy, but Kurt Schilling was a guy I would have voted for anyway, but his postseason resume I thought really put him over the top, and I do take a look at that as a factor.
Would you say Big Poppy too? Sort of he must have. I think he rode that a little bit. Whatever questions you might have had, going, wow, that guy was a beast in the postseason.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I do pause at least 5 seconds and think, hey, the name of this thing is the Hall of Fame. And I do think fame is some element. When you perform in the big spotlight, you perform on the October stage, if you're deciding a World Series champion, there's that Hall of Fame. Like there's an element to your immortality already if you are that kind of fall legend. And not everybody on this group was in that, kind of Reggie Jackson, David Ortiz, aura, but yeah, I mean, Utley has some incredible postseasons, and I do factor that in for sure.
Do you when you look at D-WAR, and we talked about that a little bit, I find that as a very I think we said it's a subjective stat, but I always find myself when I look at a player and I look at his performance going, like I said, like, wow, Abreu was not as good as I thought. I was giving him props for being a great defensive player, and then I see something like that. Does that how does that mess you up at all when you look at something like that, like it did me?
It does mess me up. It does mess me up, but the previous generation also messed me up because I would watch a player and think, my goodness, what a fantastic defensive player, but it wasn't always true. The eye test remembers the flashy plays. The eye test remembers the dive, the crazy. It doesn't remember 162 game grinds on making the routine play is their range so effortless that they cover a lot of ground without you even noticing the range. So it's flawed either way. You can trust your eyes, you can trust the numbers, and defense is I'm not saying it's a crapshoot, but it's subjective, and um, it just gets tough. It's just a difficult thing to measure, and I hope that someday somebody figures out really, really, really how to measure. Maybe with the there's more and more cameras in the ballpark. There's more and more things that they can quantify in terms of range, running speed. But the catch probability on a ball in the air to the outfield. There's a lot of things that they measure now that hopefully we get some consensus. Like, yeah, that is a good measure of. Because it isn't like I didn't look this year because I don't vote for him and don't plan on it. But Omar Vizquel won a ton of Gold Gloves, but I don't think the defensive metrics, if I remember right, are that great.
They're pretty good all time. I think he's got around a 20, give or take, defensive WAR for his career. So yeah, but he played a lot of years.
Yeah,
You had a ton of years.
So that really.
And then the other thing is too is I don't. There's a lot of bad defensive players already in the Hall of Fame. So, I try not to hold. Defense I think is a huge plus. If somebody's a borderline, like who do we talk about it? Like Abreu, Sheffield.
Right.
If their offensive power is enough to offset that, I'm okay with it. I don't. I give more weight to the offensive side than the defensive side.
I listened to a podcast. It turns out from a couple of years ago, Sheffield and Sean Casey, and it was interesting to hear Sheffield in his own words for an hour and a half, talk about his career. And when they talked about fielding, he goes, "Well, I'm a shortstop." Like, okay, here we go. This ought to be. It's like, yeah. So they always played me basically, without saying it this way, out of position, right? So they say, "Do you want me to play third base?" Well, they said, well, "That's because you can't play shortstop. You got to play third base." So I'm trying to help the team, and I get penalized for it. And then, and so everywhere I played was out of position, but I caught everything that was hit to me. was his answer, and I thought,
Well,
really, that's what you're gonna go with? That doesn't talk much about range, and I think about that. And he's a guy who his defense, I think I turned it as was disinterested, was kind of how I looked at Gary Sheffield.
yeah, I mean the Cody Stavenhagen from the Athletic did a great story on Sheffield in advance of the vote, and kind of caught the self-contradictory nature of Gary Sheffield. And one quote might not even add up to the next one, or the one after that, or the one after that. Wildly entertaining, wildly interesting. I mean, I covered him a little bit when I was on the beat as an opposing player. And I was kind of liked him. I think he's a smart guy, and I think he was a incredible hitter. Like somebody in his family said, if you're not 8 years old at some point and you were imitating that bat waggle that he had, and, like that alone shows like the impact he had. And the bats, I mean, his bat speed was incredible. 500 home run, 500 plus home runs. So the defense, I can't. If it said, "Name, what are your top 5 Gary Sheffield defensive plays?" You might have to give me some time. But I remember that bat waggle.
Yeah, that he was a shortstop, but only meant that he was the best player on the team when growing up, and so he got used to being shortstop. But somewhere along the way, somebody didn't have the nerve to go up and go, you might want to think about another position. So yeah, he was a very entertaining listen though, and to hear it in his own words was quite something. And Sheffield comes up again. I saw in 2026 the ERA committee ballot along with Kent and Delgado, Gonzalez. And Garcia Parr. So I hope he might have the opportunity, because I don't believe that his peers have anything but great respect for him as a player. At least that's what I've heard when I hear people talk about him.
Yeah, for sure. I think he was well liked. Yeah, he was interesting in talking about in that athletic story about being named in the Mitchell report and how upset he was, and how people have it all wrong. But the longer he talked, the more he kind of contradicted even that account of what he was using. It was, he was using the cream and the clear because he was working out with Bonds, and it was the story kind of changed about how much he was using and when and why and all that stuff. So it's really a confounding case. There's a lot of those PED things that are. That's it. It's interesting that he'll be up against, because you always think about like who else is on the ballot.
Right.
Kent is kind of the same, like incredible offensive player at his position, whose defense, I think in his case was a little bit. I think he was much better defensively than Sheffield for one, but then his reputation, he was really good at the defense at the double play.
Double play, right?
His
You
range
covered him,
wasn't
right?
great.
So.
Yeah, I covered him for 3. I wasn't particularly a fan of his sparkling personality, but
He took that with him from New York, by the way. He had that same personality in New York, so you know.
Take it wherever he wants. But he worked hard to get better, and I think I know I've talked to players who say, if you have a couple bad years defensively, that stays with you forever. If you have a couple bad years offensively, you hit better, and people go, oh, he taught himself how to hit. People, it's really hard to shake a defensive reputation, and I think he was probably always below average, but he worked hard to get closer to that average than people give him credit for. And I don't think he was a bad defensive second baseman.
And sometimes I think people can not really appreciate the amount of effort that it takes a guy to go from being a not good fielder to being a, good average passable major league second baseman. And if you can do that when you hit like Jeff Kent, if you're like, well, I'm league average defensively and I'm the best hitting second baseman offensively, that's still an insanely valuable player.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of aside from the Hall of Fame vote, but I remember I was asking Dwayne Kuiper, who was a longtime second baseman, who was a Giants broadcaster. I asked him once about Kent defensively, and we were happy to be watching the infield practice. He goes, "You know what I admire about Jeff Kent is he's out there right now working at what he's bad at." And he says most people, when they take infield, they work at what they're good at because it gives them confidence that they're good at getting the ball to the right. They kind of set themselves up and handle more balls to the right. Kent would always put himself in position to work on his weaknesses, to address them. And I thought, ultimately that kind of paid off in some slim percentage points. But that mentality, I think, said a lot about him.
Well, and Sheffield, with those guys that he's going to be on the 26th year committee ballot with, Kent, Delgado, Gonzalez, no more. So at least defensively, he's not going to have too many people that are going to make him look bad.
No Paul Blair or
nothing like that. Talk a little bit maybe about the ballot next year, just for a moment as a preview. People are already kind of putting out who's going to be. We've got Ichiro and the other guy that people talk about, and I'd be interested in your thought on him, CC Sabathia. So where are you on those guys?
Yeah, it's boy. You know what? I don't know. I should say I don't know. I remember taking a quick peek and thought I would have to listen to arguments for Sabathia. I think my initial reaction was, nah. But like I said, that's a passing glance, and that's what I was rallying about earlier. Like, you can't go on that passing glance anymore. You have to really study it. But he's a guy I have to probably hear the case for, or look for the case for. I can't remember which voter I saw. It might have been one of our. I think it was Tim Britton, who covers the Metro, but he said he looks. When he looks at the candidate, he looks for reasons to vote yes, which I think is a good starting point, right? Let's go open mind and say let's lean towards yes and see where it takes us. So I might try to do that when I sit down with the ballot next year, because you mentioned Pedroia earlier. He's another guy that I think I'd have to look at, because off the top of my head, probably not. But you start looking at who are the comparable hitters. How long was his peak? Right. What kind of impact did he have in the postseason? What kind of overall player was it? So on and so forth. But that gut reaction, and thank goodness, Baseball Reference and other outlets have kind of instant resources where you can look at 20 different things like that at one time.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we could do this podcast. We couldn't do the podcast without Baseball Reference and StatHead.
They're an invaluable resource. We use them like all the time. It's like, oh, what was his WAR? Let me look at his seasons. I need his information.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
are we recalibrating, Dan? Like, so you mentioned Sabathia, and Felix Hernandez was also going to be on that ballot next year. And so he sort of had people recalibrate when he won the Cy Young with a
mhm,
13-12 record. And so that
yeah,
was like, wow, how could that happen?
yeah,
And so I'm having trouble because you can't use some of the old numbers, right?
mhm.
3,000 strikeouts and two is even 200 wins, like asking for too much for some people now. So we're all in the middle, like you guys as voters, of trying to recalibrate in real time.
Well, you see that incredible stat? I think it was the Twitter account, Not Gaetti, where it's the
Yeah.
first year since 1978 that there's no 3,000 hits, 300 game winner, or 500 home run hitter. And it's only the second time, I think, since 1948. And as you said, those who used to be the ones, that's what you would look at if you were Hall of Fame. How close is he to 3,000, 300, or 500? Um, and now it's, OPS plus. I think for the better. I'm not. Those stats still take work for me to like. Yeah, okay, let me figure this out. I'm 54, right? So they're new. They're not from my baseball cards as a kid, but I do think they show his value in ways that other stats couldn't. And but it was nice having the easy benchmarks. No, 3,000 hits, boom, you're in. Now, what's the OPS that gets you in? What's the WAR that gets you in? We don't. That may be established at some point, but you couldn't say like 3,500 and need no further explanation. So, it's Utley and some of the other guys on the ballot this year. I could peek really quick. They didn't have 2,000 hits even. That would have been
Unthinkable.
crossed off the list. Yeah.
You
So
would
you
never
need,
put in a guy with
yeah,
that few
and,
hits.
yeah, and you know, Andrew Jones batting average laughed out of the ballot before, but now you factor all the other stuff like D-WAR and uh, uh, the other metrics that show his value. So um, I do, with Sabathia, right? In a previous generation, if he pitched, he would have been one of those guys that won 300 games. He would have pitched deeper
Mhm.
into games. He would have, um, racked up bigger pitch counts, but he would have got 300 games. He would have been used different, and he was the workhorse guy of that generation. So yes, do we recalibrate? Look at him like, hey, this is the definition of the workhorse, a winner in his era. How many playoff teams was he on? How many postseasons was he a part of? Because of his durability and his consistency.
The year he went to Milwaukee, I think I saw this just the other day. I'm gonna do
Mm-hmm.
this as a trivia question. So he led both the National League and the American League in shutouts in the same year.
Is that right?
He's the only player to do
That's a
that.
Yeah,
cool statistic.
that's a great one. Okay, he's in.
Yeah, that's perfect.
And right, so there's no, we talked about this going before we got on. So there's no quotient, right? There's no number. Pick that number. We know it's not WAR. We know there's nothing there. You mentioned Ops Plus. I think we too value that very highly. But if you had a cutoff on Ops Plus, Ichiro with an Ops Plus of 107 for his career, oh well, he's not a Hall of Famer. No, you can't do that.
Right. He's a guy that could potentially have, if you're like, well, if you combine his time in Japan in the major leagues, he had
Yeah,
4,200 hits. He's a slam dunk Hall of Famer, but he only had a career 108 OPS. So he's not a Hall of Famer? Like,
right. No, and then he's one of those guys. It's a much shorter list, but you look at cultural impact. How did he change the game? What did he bring? He brought an immense amount of attention, and he was a pioneer in that way for Japanese players, and that matters. What he did, what he brought, and how he fared here, his success really mattered a lot.
And he was famous. You said it's about being fame, and Ichiro,
Yeah,
that's it. That's fame right there. Everybody knows by one name who this player is, whether
yeah,
it's American or Japanese, by the way.
yeah, yeah. Right. If you can go by one name, yeah, yeah. Hall of Fame. I mean, I do think that's. I wonder I don't know if they've done it in the past, but Fernando Valenzuela. If you looked at him because they have that category now for contributors, you could make a case for Fernando Valenzuela. He meant so much and still does, and he still resonates, and it was pretty good.
Yeah, and I think you'd say Fernando, and most people aren't thinking Rodney, by the way. So
Right, right. He's still pitching.
So he's trying to come back at age 42 or something like that. I think
47.
47. Is he 47? Wow,
Yeah,
that'd be a good story.
that would be a
So
good story.
so we can. Well, I think we've covered what we need to today. If there's anything else that we didn't cover, we'll maybe get you back. Can you talk to us about? Are you still, you're not covering the Giants now? But how do you keep your status as a BBWAA voter when you're not a beat writer? Where does it transition
Yeah,
into it
it's a
being
good question.
national?
Yeah, and that's an increasingly relevant question because there's not that old crusty beat writer anymore. The generations tend to last longer or last shorter. It's
Yep.
like starting pitchers now. Their careers are shorter because the grind is so much difficult than it used to. But I'm a senior editor in the baseball department, so I edit a lot, and then I continue to write um, feature stories on baseball uh, in addition to those responsibilities. So I'm doing a story on Tyler Kepner. Have you ever had him on?
Yeah, we haven't had Tyler on yet. He doesn't. He's not far from us. We'd love to have him on. We really like his stuff.
He sent me a story. He said on the oldest living major league player right now is about to turn 100, and he happens to live in my neck of the woods. So I'm gonna go track him down. Apparently, he's doing well and healthy, but it's now you're gonna ask me the name, and I'm gonna draw a blank.
Well, Carl Erskine is 97, so it's not Carl Erskine, I think.
No, no.
He's close.
That's funny because Tyler said, I did this on Carl Erskine.
I'm not sure who it is either at this point, but yeah, I think those guys, Tyler and Jason and all that stuff. We kind of have we'll go back and forth. And Jason came up with a great stat today. I don't know if you read his article saying that Helton and Maurer are only the 6th duo. He actually, I think, in the past half century to get elected to the Hall of Fame, playing their with one team. So it's Rivera and Martinez and Gwynn and Ripken and Brett and Yount. Bench and Yastrzemski and Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford. And like Jason said, that is a very cool group of to be a part of.
That's a very, it's incredible. He's so great at finding things that kind of blow your socks off.
Yeah. So, So and I also read your article on Randy White, which I thought was really interesting. So you kind of venture off of baseball into other areas.
Yeah, that's part of why I was so late to become a Hall of Fame voter, because you have to have 10 consecutive years in the BBWAA. So as the Giants beat writer for a while, the San Francisco Giants beat writer, and then went from that into football and covered the Niners for 5 years, and then went back to baseball. So I kept restarting my clock. But I have football. I didn't seek that one out, but I have football connections from those days and football friendships from those days. And somebody said, hey, I covered Mike Singletary, his eventful time as a Niners coach. So it's more along those lines. But he's saying Singletary's involved with this Randy White thing, and Too Tall Jones. They're trying to fight opioid use at the high school football level, and knew that I would be interested. And I was. So I wrote that, and I'm working on a Warrior story right now. I'm like a one-man Olympics when it comes to writing, lots of different sports.
Well, showing your versatility, so to speak.
Art Shalleck is the name of the pitcher who's about to turn 100 years old. He was born on April 25th, 1924, a day on which Babe Ruth homered and Walter Johnson pitched. And then the Yankees first baseman in that game was Wally Pipp, because the Garrett streak had not started yet. So that's how old he is.
Yeah.
Wow.
That should be quite something. Hope you can get some good stuff, out of a guy who's turning 100. So
me too.
Well, thank you, Dan. Appreciate
Thank
having
you so
on.
much.
We're grateful, and we'd certainly like to do this annually if you're still interested, and hopefully still voting, and because we like getting it right from the horse's mouth.
Mark Gordon, thank you so much. It's really fun.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on, and can't wait to talk to you next time.
Yeah, let's do it again. 365 days.
Thanks.
Thank you.